Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's podcast, I interview my friend and colleague, Heather Carlson. Heather's career in marriage and family therapy comes after nearly a decade of corporate media sales and another 10 years as a full-time parent raising 3 children with her partner of over 20 years. Her clinical experience began with work in an addiction and mental health treatment facility where she led weekly group therapy and worked as a family therapist. Heather trained with an emotionally focused therapy supervisor to develop and refine her EFT skills and create a foundation for her work through an attachment therapy lens. In addition to her private practice, Heather has been developing curriculum for group experiences and workshops since 2018. She recently developed a women's retreat called Deep Rest, which focuses on overcoming the obstacles and challenges that prevent many women from rest and self-care. And encourage you to visit her website to learn more about her group. So without further ado, here's my interview with Heather. All right, Heather, welcome to the Mind of a Therapist podcast. The first question I ask guests is, how do you view change? What does it take for someone to change, for a relational system to change? What's necessary for that?
How long do we have?
It's a big question.
I'm going to give you my elevator speech on change. I am pretty heavily steeped in my work in attachment theory. So my view of change is rooted in attachment, which also means it's rooted in systems, because attachment is about our relationships.
Yeah.
So I really think that change occurs in even in ourselves, our own attachment to our greater system, when we can start to understand how we experience those relationships, even if it's with ourselves, and by organizing our own experiences through our emotions and making sense of them and tying our emotions to our behaviors and really having that link start to make sense. Once we can start to understand, oh, I do this thing because I feel this way, or I make meaning of it this way, we have a lot more control over our behavior.
Yeah.
So I think that emotion is the mechanism of change, and that's the foundation for my work.
Yeah, that Sue Johnson metaphor of the relational dances we do, and the emotion is the music. It's that driving force, and when we can get in touch with that, and the cognitions related to that, it makes our behaviors make a lot more sense.
Oh my gosh, it's one of my favorite parts of my work.
Yeah.
Sitting with people, is sitting with clients and helping them organize. I'm going to use that word, organize their experiences and say, oh my gosh, I feel this way. I haven't really ever named that. I didn't know that was what was my emotion, was my internal experience. And that's why I'm doing, XYZ, whatever that thing is. So yeah, seeing the light come on when people make sense of their own experience and their own behavior is, yes, one of my favorite parts of our work.
And it's just so powerful to take the time to slow down and just simply name the feeling and tune into it, not trying to change it, but to just be with what we're experiencing. I find when I do that, oftentimes there's a lot of anxiety for me at times. And when I slow down and tune into that anxiety, it often kind of, loosens its potency and allows me to get to know that part of me that it is anxious.
Well, right. And it also puts you into your body.
Yeah.
It gets you out of your head and into your body. When you say I think you said you ground yourself, right?
Hmm.
When you slow down and tune in, it automatically puts us back into our bodies, and our bodies are so wise.
Yeah.
They have so much to share with us and so much to tell us about what is happening. We have to be able to tune into that, though. That's the mindfulness, the awareness piece that is a little tricky for me sometimes with clients, because I often feel that word mindfulness and the word awareness have been they've been cheapened, I think, in kind of social settings and social conversations. And in our work, those words mean a lot to me. And they are actually at the essence of how we begin to tune in. How do we listen to our bodies? Well, we have to have the skills of mindfulness and awareness. How do we stop? And I'm like looking down at my own stomach right now,
Yeah.
because I'm always telling my clients, what is happening on the inside? And I kind of look down, to our bodies, away from our minds, away from those all powerful cognitions. But the mindfulness and awareness is the thing that allows us the space to pause and check in. And
Yeah.
that is so grounding. Oh, I'm anxious today. What about Andrew? Like, what about I'm excited anxious today,
Sure. Yeah,
right?
I
A
get
little
that.
bit of giddy anxious. Or what
Uh-huh.
about dread anxious, right? That fine tuning when we can pause is the other thing we can find.
Yeah. And I was just thinking maybe I'll invite those who are listening right now to pause the podcast and just tune in to how they're feeling right now, because it's so invaluable. I don't do it enough, and so I'll invite you, whoever's listening, to just take a deep breath and tune in to look down like you were doing, Heather, and tune into how you're feeling. And then whenever you're ready, you can press play again and listen to the rest of this conversation. Heather, this relates to, I think, what we're going to be talking about. You've shared with me outside the podcast that you've been learning a lot about burnout, about this idea of self-care, people's understandings of self-care, and yeah, I'd be curious. Maybe we can start with maybe you'd share a bit about your own experiences with burnout and what's led you to study it more extensively, and then you've started a group to support women who are experiencing burnout. I'd like to talk about that too, but maybe starting with your own experience.
Yeah, that is a great place to start, because that truly is where it all began. I opened a private practice in September of 2021. And so, if we can all take ourselves back to that time, that was the fall, where kids were going back to school. A lot of companies were inviting their employees to come back into their shared office spaces and kind of pull them out of their houses and back into workplaces and office buildings. And so there was this hum in the air of getting back to normal. And I opened a private practice at that same moment in time in September 2021. And I kind of hit the ground running, as I tend to do. And I had a full practice really quickly, which was, of course, wonderful. That's what I had set out to do. And I also have a business degree and a business background. And so, using my business mind, I had structured my practice to be running a certain way. And it was very efficient from a business perspective. But I had kind of forgotten that I'm a therapist and that the resource of my work is me.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Big oversight in retrospect, but I had overlooked that I am the resource, and it's my physical presence, my emotional presence, my ability to be cognitively with my clients and putting pieces together and finding patterns, and my spiritual self, my soulful self. All of those parts are in my work and in our work. And the way I had set my practice up was not conducive to this type of work. And I didn't realize that. And so I was just going along and had my sessions stacked too tightly together. And by December, I was burned out. So it did not take long. It only took a short few months. But we were also coming off the pandemic. And that's an important piece for me in this story because as a woman and a parent coming off of the pandemic, where I had been really heavily involved in caretaking for my children, and their needs had increased. I was all of a sudden part school teacher, I was math teacher and English teacher, and I was also doing a lot of emotional support for them. My partner and husband was also at home during the pandemic, so all the five of us were suddenly together. And
Yeah.
that happens in a lot of households, not every household and not in every circumstance, but often in heterosexual marriage, the female partner becomes the emotional gatekeeper and caretaker for her family system. And that was happening across the country. But women are also caretakers for maybe their work family and maybe their neighbor or their school PTO. I mean, the list kind of keeps going. And so post pandemic, a lot of women were feeling already weary. And I was in that camp, but kind of excited about opening my practice and not doing the thing we opened this podcast talking about, which was tuning in and slowing down and saying, hey, how am I feeling opening this practice aside from really excited?
Yeah.
Oh, a little tired and a
Yeah.
little weary. So I didn't pay as much attention to that part and opened the practice. And by December, and I think these symptoms are pretty important to share. I was grumpy. I was pretty irritable. I was in low mood. And I had really, and this is hugely important, I was noticing a lack of empathy.
Hmm.
And that is such a red flag warning for a lot of things, including burnout. But Andrew, I didn't know that much about burnout. I had never experienced it in my life to this degree. And I actually was questioning. I thought, oh my gosh, I think I am in a low depression, low mood, kind of some symptoms that looked and smelled and acted a whole lot like low level depression symptoms. And I thought, huh, really? Now depression? Like I feel so this is where I wanted to be in my life. It didn't quite make sense to me. I couldn't figure out what the trigger would have been.
Hmm.
And so it just dawned on me one day, oh, maybe this is burnout.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how this whole journey began, was with my own burnout story.
Yeah, and thanks so much for sharing that, Heather. I know obviously I'm a man. I don't have that lived experience of that caretaking part. I know that I've read some of Dick Schwartz's work, the founder of IFS, and he talks about in his clinical experience. That's an experience that a lot of women who have consulted with him have experienced in our society, and it makes perfect sense that leads to burnout. I know you've also written a journal article on being a caregiver in the sandwich generation, so both with your children and with your father. And um, be curious to talk a bit about um, folks who find themselves in that situation of care. Share a bit more about what's been helpful for you, and you notice that caretaking part of you starting to really show up. And I mean, you mentioned they're slowing down, but what else is helpful for you with that caretaking part?
Well, there's I'm thinking we actually might need to go back a bit even
Yeah.
before we get to like how do we, you talking about the caretaking with the sandwich generation piece?
Yeah, that, and I'm hearing that's part of the pie for you with
The
what led to
burnout.
burnout. Yeah.
Yeah, the caretaking. Well, if we're thinking of sandwich generation, which I think that's it's interesting that you bring up that sandwich generation idea because I do think that the pandemic offered kind of a similar environment that sandwich generation folks experience. And the similarity is that there was caretaking of people in different generations who have different sets of needs, and the are not complementary, they compete.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think the pandemic also provided an environment where that was the case. You had all of a sudden, you're trying to do your own work. You're in your generation, right? You're maybe the parent trying to do your own work. And suddenly, instead of your kids going off to school, like I was saying, you're now trying to do your own work while also being this other role of school teacher and
Yeah.
and referee, like on the recess playground. Like kids you're trying to figure out what kind of like play and structure they have, but it's all indoors and all these things. So I think that there's a parallel between those two things, and the burnout becomes because there isn't enough. There is it's constant giving,
Mm.
and it's constant attunement that is outward. It's taking care of others. And so with sandwich generation caretakers, they're looking at the needs of their own work life often. Um, the caregivers are often between 45 and 65. And so they have children who are dependent under 18, all of those needs that go with parenting. And then they have an older parent of their own who has increased needs. And that could be doctor's appointments and preparing meals. And for me, trimming my father's toenails and fingernails, and all of these really sort of intimate caretaking acts that I suddenly found myself doing with him. And those have, you physically have to go over to do them. But then there is this emotional piece
Yeah.
when you're taking care of your parents, and the roles are reversing. So again, there was I think in the pandemic there was an emotional piece too. A lot of us were lacking our usual outlets.
Mm-hmm.
So the caretaking demands had increased, the stress had increased, right? We were all worried. We didn't know. There was a lot of fear circulating during the pandemic. And so the demands on our systems overall were increasing, and we had lost our outlets to take
Yeah.
care of ourselves and to rest and to pause.
Yeah. And I'd be curious to hear a bit about you recognized the burnout was the the experience you're having. You're experiencing those symptoms of depression, weariness, and what did you do from there?
Well, I do what I've done my whole life. I went to the library.
Nice.
I need some books on this. What is going on with me? I think this is burnout. And Andrew, the other thing I want to mention is that simultaneously, as I was slowly starting to put the pieces together of, oh, this is burnout for me, women in my life, like my girlfriends, my network, I started hearing stories of girlfriends saying to me similar things like, I am so irritable. Um, I, I'm so tired. I feel really run down. I don't know. There sort of became a joke. I had several friends of mine. I'm in my mid 40s, and a lot of my girlfriends are too. And I had several of them in a row say to me, I think I'm in perimenopause. And I thought, oh, we're 42, 41, 43. Like, that's really early perimenopause. How funny that I have all these friends saying this to me. Well, then lo and behold, I go into my private practice. I do a lot of couples work and families work. And so I have a lot of similarly aged women in my practice. And I have 3 women in my practice. It is not that big. Say to me through the course of our work, I think I'm in perimenopause. I've made an appointment with my doctor. And suddenly it dawned on me, this is not perimenopause all of a sudden for like this huge collection of women in my life. This is burnout.
Mm.
And it was interesting. Part of me realizing that was happening for me, my own burnout, was seeing it in others. and starting to put the pieces together. And so that was kind of how I started recognizing it was burnout. So I went to the library and I thought, what do you do about burnout? I really didn't know what to do. And this was the spark for me. Once I started doing a lot of reading, this was sort of the spark that caused me to want to create and share what I had learned with others, kind of that fire in my belly. Like, more of us need to understand the difference between burnout and depression, and what the heck do you do when you realize you are in burnout. Um, and oh, I lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Library,
Yeah.
reading, the spark. Oh, learning about the difference between
Uh-huh.
burnout and depression. That was another important piece. Oh, that they're just, I didn't, there wasn't enough information about what to do.
Yeah. Hmm. I know in our my experience from what I learned in our grad program was self-care, right? It's this word, if you to prevent burnout, when you do feel burnout, just do self-care, right? Do some yoga or stretches or whatever your hobby is. And I'd be curious to hear your take and understandings of self-care, and if that was a piece that came up as you were starting to look at what do I do about burnout.
Absolutely. Well, it was part of my frustration. It was because I was like, wait a second, I actually have great sleep hygiene. I eating well and eating locally and all of those sorts of things are really important to me. So I felt like my nutritional health was pretty good. Um, and I also exercise regularly. Yes, I participate in, I live in Boulder, so I hike a lot and I'm outside a lot, biking, all those things. So what I was doing wasn't enough. But that was frustrating to me
Hmm.
because I was sitting there thinking, well, if this isn't enough, then what the heck are you supposed to do? I kind of felt like, Andrew, I was already doing what you ought to, and I'm doing that in quotations, what you're
Yeah.
supposed to be doing to, I already had a self-care practice that was pretty robust.
Yeah. Here I
And
am
so
doing all
then,
these
yeah,
self-care robust, I'm checking all the boxes, and yet it's not showing the results I'd like. I'm still feeling burnt out.
right. And when you mentioned that when you and I were in graduate school together, there's this sort of like self-care thing that's like shoved down our throats, like they're constantly talking about it, but that's all they talk about. It's really important that you have a self-care practice. Imagine all the nursing school students and education students and like, what are all the fields, right, that where they're using, kind of like you and I do in our work, their all of those things I mentioned at the top of the podcast, their spiritual self, their physical self, emotional, cognitive self, all of those parts of themselves are there required for their work. And so, yes, we all hear take care of yourself, but what does that actually look like? And what I found was that when I realized I was burned out, I actually was kind of angry because it sort of felt like I had been duped. I was like, I'm doing these things. I take this really seriously in my profession,
Hmm.
and it didn't work.
Yeah.
And so that again was sort of the catalyst for me creating this group curriculum, because I wanted, once I discovered what does work, it was very, very different than what I had been doing and what I understood rest and self-care to actually be.
Mm. Will you say more about that shift in understanding of rest and self-care? Hearing the initial understanding was it's just, eating right, exercising, going on hikes, doing all these things that are good for us. And um, be curious what your understanding of rest was initially and how that shifted.
Initially, I thought that what I was doing was enough. I read in the evenings often. I have what I would consider pretty a low tech life. So I use technology. I have a smartphone, all of those things, but I don't engage in social media by choice and really manage my screens and those sort of things. So I already, again, was doing a lot of what's sort of considered restful things. I participated in yoga. I have a morning meditation practice. So as you can see, a lot of those, when you think of a list of, if you were to ask a room of, 20 people, what is self-care? I think you'd hear a lot of yoga, naps, bath time, and
Yeah.
I already was doing all of those
It
things.
from what you're sharing, Heather, it sounds like you are an A student with self-care. Meditation in the morning, no social media. I know you garden, go on hikes. Yeah, that was the quintessential self-care image.
Right. And can you imagine how frustrating it
Yeah.
was to then be living that lifestyle and have it not be sufficient?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was actually a little scary because I thought, I don't
Mm.
know, maybe, I had the thoughts that a lot of I heard things I heard from my clients. Maybe this isn't the work for me. Maybe I'm in over my head. I mean, all of these, there's a lot of self-doubt that goes with burnout, and really a lot of analyzing all these aspects of your life. And so when I started reading, though, thank goodness I started reading. And when I started reading, what changed things for me, that shift you were asking me about, was that I had had it all wrong. Is that those things I do, and I do, I can be self reflective and say, you're right. I do think I have a really sound foundation for a self care practice in my life. But all that is the foundation. It's a good solid foundation. So I think I keep doing all of those things. I'm still doing all of those. But a year later, more than a year later, what has really shifted and been just this seismic change in the pattern of my life is that I now incorporate throughout every day little tiny, and I call them sips,
Nice.
little tiny sips of rest.
Uh,
And that was the thing that was so empowering to me is, oh, this isn't these grand gestures. It's not like I have to go to a spa. It's not like I have to have a massage or all these expensive things that you think of when a lot of us think of self-care. That actually isn't the ticket. The ticket is a practice. So I haven't really read this term anywhere. This is sort of a term that I've applied to it, but I think of rest now as a practice, just like I have a hygiene practice with my dental care. And I eat breakfast every morning, I brush my teeth every morning. Those are things that are really woven into the fabric of my day, and they are a practice, and they happen daily. They're a routine. And so now I have a rest practice, and it is in these little tiny digestible bits throughout the day.
hmm.
And that has been, if I could sum it up in a sentence, that has been the huge shift
Yeah.
for me.
Will you share a bit more about what you do when you take one of these sips of rest? I love that.
Right. So in my, particularly when I'm at work, I have breaks between my sessions. And I used to be one of those clinicians. And I know if there are any clinicians listening, they're like sitting there going, yep, that's what I do. We have clinical notes. Every job has drudgery. And part
Uh-huh.
of the drudgery of our profession is clinical notes. And so, a client system or family or whatever would walk out the door, and I would have a few minutes between sessions, and I would quickly sit down and start trying to capture my notes. And then the next client would show up. And so I'm back on again. And so, in that sense, my nervous system was on at a really high level because that's what this work takes, hour after hour. And then I had an hour long lunch. And guess what I would do? Quickly eat and then go back and get on email and do consultation calls with other clinicians and do work on clinical notes and all those sorts of things. So, in essence, my body was vibrating at a very high level, and I was using up all of my resource just probably pretty early in the day and not even really recognizing it. So, the small sips are now I don't do clinical notes between sessions. So, this is a radical departure from what I used to do.
Sure. I think it would be for any practitioner. Maybe a little anxiety provoking. I'm not going to do it right after this session.
Yeah, it was but you know what I discovered, Andrew, is that we have to decide what we're willing to give up.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of what is fuel for burnout is thinking that you can do it all.
Yeah.
And so I had to decide, what am I willing to give up? Well, as it turns out, what I'm willing to give up is I don't see clients on Tuesdays. It's a non-client contact day for me. And so after my Monday full day of sessions, I now, set aside an hour or two on Tuesdays, and I'm willing to give up some of that personal time on Tuesday to work on my clinical notes from the day before. And that actually has turned out to be a really sustaining way for me to, of course, get my clinical notes done. Those are very important to me. And yet also on Mondays, just using that as the example, between sessions, I will go walk outside. There's a big parking lot outside of my office with huge hardwood trees. And so even though it's a parking lot, maybe not the most scenic, but it's still outside.
Yeah.
And so I do really crazy things, Andrew. I eat my lunch sometimes standing up in the parking lot under this huge tree that's out there.
Well, it doesn't sound too crazy to me, Heather.
No, it doesn't. Okay. Yeah, I do some pretty funny things. I was like, should I take, I mean, I literally, this became such a focus, is how do I take these small sips every day throughout the day?
Yeah.
And so lunch is a 10-minute activity for most of us. Unfortunately, we are not Europeans. We do not sit and linger and, luxuriate in our lunches. We're a lot of us probably take our little Tupperware dish outside and gobble it down. And so lunch is really not that long of an activity. I do not take any screens or digital anything with me. I leave my office for lunch. But when I say leave my office, what I literally mean is I leave my little, I'm in an office suite with 9 other clinicians. And so we have a beautiful waiting room, and there's a table out there. And actually, just this week, I was sitting at that table eating my lunch, because it's pretty chilly outside to be out there right now eating lunch, just to get out of the 4 walls of my office,
Yeah.
just to change my scenery. When we remove ourselves from our work environment, we can also kind of remove ourselves from that mental list of things that can go with being in that space.
Yeah.
And so I go and I sit again, just quietly by myself in the waiting room, and I eat my lunch. And so I met someone, this is the water cooler thing that's happening again post pandemic. Another clinician that I had never met that just started working in our office came by and said to me, I've never seen anyone sit at this table and eat. And it is a table to be, for people to eat at. I
Yes.
thought, yeah, I'm eating at this little table.
Yeah.
But that's one of the ways. So
That's nice.
my lunch is sort of sacred, and I use that time to just be, to just enjoy my food and take some deep breaths. I step outside often and do some stretching. I'll do grounding exercises outside. A lot of us know what 4 square breathing is. I'll do things like that. I will do something kind of like a Buddhist or Zen mindfulness practice. Like, I notice the leaves. Oh, the leaves are really green today. I feel the breeze. So, all of that we talked about earlier in the podcast about tuning in, mindfulness awareness, I am using all of those skills to give my body rest.
Yeah. And how important that is in our fast-paced society to slow down. And I've been thinking with what you're sharing, both creating those sips, like in terms of putting a few minutes aside in between clients. I mean, just so important to regulate and an internal family system, we call it, then lead with self energy in your sessions, where you from a place of calm and compassion. And how you were saying, when you were experiencing the burnout, it kind of was getting in the way of empathy. So figuring out, we're all different, but maybe we all have different tolerances for what our schedules can look like. But if we do have the ability to make shifts in our schedule, how important that is to take that time and take that sip. But I was also thinking of like the simple things that I do outside of work, cooking, cleaning around the house. I know for me, I often will be listening to a podcast, and I love that. I'm a podcaster. I love listening to podcasts.
Mhm.
But I've been thinking as you've been talking of, that just in looking at the leaves or just like just eating the lunch without anything in your ears, without any technology, and just paying attention to the textures and the tastes of the food, and engaging in that mindfulness, right? As we are going throughout the day, how rejuvenating that can be.
Right. And as I'm listening to you sort of reflect on your own patterns, which I love, of course, and finding, even in just this conversation, Andrew, you just found a way that you can make a very small shift
Yeah.
and capture a little bit of rest and opportunity for mindfulness and attunement. So I love that even in just this conversation, that is how easily I actually believe most of us can find these opportunities. I think they're a lot more easily found than we envision them. And I think a lot of us feel that self care is about time. And then as soon as you mention the word time, people kind of freak out and they're like, nobody has time. We are all busy. This is such a fast paced life and world. And I say, yes, I hear you. And that is true. Now let's start thinking about your day. Do you drive to work? And they say, yeah, I only have an 8-minute commute though. Okay, well, we have just added 16 minutes of time for mindfulness and awareness into your day. We just found it and it's already there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
your drive time is now going to be silent.
Mm-hmm.
So put your phone in the back seat where you can't reach it.
Yep.
Don't be tempted, right? So many of us try to fit those phone calls in. I mean, I know this because I do it and I did it. Um, and we try to fit those phone calls in on the commutes. And so I had one client, she said, well, I have an hour long commute. And I said, well, perfect. So, the whole thing doesn't have to be, you don't have to drive 2 hours in silence. We're thinking of sips, right? So, how about the first 10 minutes? What would it be like if the first 10 minutes of your commute were a settling in, they were in silence, no radio, no podcast, no phone calls, and you're just kind of checking in like, wow, how do I feel after my day
Mm.
at work?
Yeah. Yeah.
And she was like, yeah. And then so she still has 50 minutes left, right? So I was like, well, what are the next 20 minutes? And she's like, you know, maybe I'll listen to music without words, which is also for this particular client, she found really soothing. And actually, I think that she's onto something. I think that actually is probably a great one for rest and attunement because the mind can still wander and daydream, and you can still be really checking in while that soothing background music is going on. And then she decided that last 30 minutes would be maybe a podcast, or she said, I really like to know what's going on in the world. Maybe I'll listen to the news. So I love how we took that hour for her and we kind of divided it up, and she's using that hour differently.
Ah, that's helpful. That's even helpful for me because, a part of me was like, oh, I don't want to give up podcast completely while I love doing chores around the house and listening to them. And a part of me is like, kind of engages in that black and white thinking. I said, okay, well, no more podcasts, but I love
Right.
that. Like, yeah, I can take a bit of time while I'm doing a part of cooking or cleaning and really be mindful and tune in to the moment and what I'm experiencing. But then put on the podcast. Best of both worlds. I also love that with driving too, what you're saying, because I mean, driving's just from a safety driving is the most dangerous thing we do, and I don't think we always appreciate that when we're on our phones and devices. And I've actually known a number of people, including had family members a few generations back that have died in car accidents. And
Mhm.
um, it's just a win-win. You're safer when you're mindfully driving. It's very dangerous. We should take it seriously, and it's good for you. So Yeah, I love, that's a great starting place, I think, for a lot of people.
Oh, I think so too. I think so too. And again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. That commute already is in their pattern. So it's just taking this thing that already exists and using it differently. Do you hear all the intention in this though?
Yeah.
I mean, this is what like my heart, I'm like getting jittery and excited because
Yeah.
this is the part about this that just turns my lights on, is that the intention. We're back to mindfulness and awareness again. Here we go. I mean,
Mhm.
there's a theme here, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But the intention, it's being a human. All of the busyness exists. All of the demands exist. We haven't crossed anything off the list, have you noticed?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But we're looking at our day more intentionally, and then therefore living it more intentionally.
Yeah. 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 It's not a matter of like what we're doing in a given day. Do it like, cause you were saying all of these different, wonderful practices you were doing, you're still experiencing burnout, but kind of how you're going throughout the day in
Mhm.
those practices, and then also in moments, those small sips in between those moments, or those whatever it is you're doing, and even maybe while you're doing those, you can take some sips of rest.
Right. With one client, she said, my office is open concept. She's in tech in Denver. And she's like, my office is open concept and there isn't really a place for any quiet. And I said, do you drive a car to work? And she said, I do. And I said, I don't know. Does it feel weird and creepy to go sit in your car for 15 minutes? Or does that feel like that could be a safe haven? And she was like, no, that sounds fantastic. So again, she already was eating lunch. She often packed her own lunch and took it to work. So all we did was shift her talking and engaging. She's a salesperson, so she talks and engages all day. And so then she was finding herself with coworkers talking and engaging for her whole lunch period. So we, again, kind of what you and I just talked about, we took that hour or whatever, 45 minutes that she generally takes for lunch, and we chopped it in half. Because again, we're trying to manage all of it, right? She wants her social cup filled.
Mm-hmm.
Her
Mm-hmm.
social part needs attention, and she loves that she has an office where she actually gets to hang out with her coworkers at lunch.
Yeah, that's nice.
So she's still going to get some of that, but she's also going to take some of her lunch hour, the eating part actually, and she's going to go and she's like, yeah, she's like, I just want to put on soothing music, kind of a theme here, and sit in her car and have some quiet space. And
Ah,
so that's what this, so I like these examples of again, taking what you're already doing and just thinking about it and thinking about it differently. And how can you chop this time up to um, to have some stillness and calmness throughout the
yeah.
day.
If this person who's consulting you likes houseplants, I recently walked by a car and they had a tiny little plant hanging from their rear view mirror. It was awesome. I think I want to get one someday, but just little things like that. I have a little house plant here on my desk, and I love just occasionally looking at it. I also have a little pumpkin, decorative pumpkin, and just having those natural objects in those places of rest, I think is really nice for me. And I thought of that, I had to mention it.
But I love that. And that's
Uh,
again, that's intention.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
these little moments of intention, putting a small plant on your desk, having a little seasonal pumpkin there, one in your car. But that also reminds me, I mean, again, that's mindfulness and awareness. It'd be so easy to blow through your day and not pay attention to your desk environment.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So that is a bit of slowing down to even notice, like, oh, I want my desk to have a little plant on it.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Something that's
Uh-huh.
coming up for me that I think is another that I'd love to share, that was another real, was hugely enlightening and really helped me reconceptualize what rest is, was some of the neuroscience, which there's tons of behind rest. And it was I like concrete things as much as I am a romantic. I also really like concrete things.
Yeah,
So the
yeah.
neuroscience was really comforting to me that this isn't all of this sort of, we live in Boulder. I'm in Boulder. This sort of, we call this woo woo Boulder stuff. There is actually some real meat to the reasons that rest actually helps.
Mhm,
And so in the neuroscience, it's the study of what happens to the the mind when the body is at rest.
mhm,
And so the researchers found that actually what they were expecting was that the mind would be very quiet, the brain activity would be quiet, but in fact it was very busy. And that's
mhm,
because there's a part of the brain called the default mode network, and it takes over, and the focused mind gets to rest. So
hmm,
that's the part of your mind that maybe is like super tuned into what a client is saying, or analyzing some data, or creating something new in your professional life. Maybe that's making a grocery list, or running after children, or solving some kind of problem. That's the focused mind. When the focused mind gets to rest, the default mode network takes over, and the daydreaming part of our mind gets really active.
hmm,
And daydreaming is also where we are super creative. So the creative part of the mind, the solution and problem solving part of the mind gets really busy.
hmm,
And so this is why it's so important to have stillness and to have the focused mind not be constantly stimulated, is because then we have this other part of the mind that kicks in, and we daydream, and we know a lot about daydreaming states. They are incredibly powerful for us to come up with new ideas, problem solving. Guess what else lives there? Empathy.
hmm.
Yeah.
Wow.
So all of a sudden, all this makes so much more sense. And it also starts to explain why, if we're at work all day and then we get in our car and we listen to a podcast for an hour and then we show up home and we talk to our partner or our family, or we immediately get on Netflix, that default mode network is not getting to rest. It is the focused mind is constantly stimulated. And that's what
Hmm.
burns us out.
Yeah.
That focused mind, it needs a break. And when it has a break, this other more creative part, the daydreaming part, the wandering mind that has so much power, that part comes alive. And so that's why these small rests throughout the day that don't include screens, listening to a podcast, that's such a great example that you gave around your own, maybe some ways that you can find rest in your daily routine. That's why it's so important to give our focused mind a rest and
Hmm.
not have it stimulated.
Yeah. And maybe there's a good place for some gulps of rest too, in light of this research, taking larger periods of time just to rest our body and let our mind go into those daydreams, creative directions, just where it will go.
Oh, it's hugely important. And a lot of people have heard of the flow state.
Hmm.
And that's what the flow state is really all about. It's when you have a focused mind that is not on a task.
Hmm.
Although flow state's interesting because this is where we get into some kind of nitty gritty on rest. So there's active rest, and then there's the other kind of rest that a lot of us often think of with self care, which is the still, the nap, the hammock, you know,
Uh-huh.
um, the the sitting without talking, sitting without any screen or digital device to offer stimulation. That's in one camp, and that is, if you think of rest on a nutrition kind of spectrum. So like if you eat a sleeve of Pringles and you're starving, yes, you have technically put food in your body, but you've put kind of an empty calorie food in your body. So that's like a lower nutrition snack. So you can think of that as certain activities that you might honor yourself with, gift yourself with. TV watching, actually.
Mm. Yeah.
Maybe listening to a podcast is restful and restorative, but maybe it's lower on the scale for you.
Mm.
Whereas sitting in stillness, going on a hike by yourself,
Mm.
A lot of people find that they have higher quote unquote nutrition rest when they're doing something where they achieve those flow states. So the focused mind could be focused on something like painting
Yeah.
or like needlepoint or some kind of drawing, those types of activities where the focused mind does have a place to land,
Uh-huh.
but that default mode network is given some space
Mm. Mm.
and it is wandering. So like you can be knitting and maybe your mind kind of slips into this flow state and that subconscious mind is wandering and maybe you're thinking about a conversation you need to have with somebody that's really tricky and you're kind of working that out. So if you think of nutrition on this kind of spectrum of, I'm sorry, rest on this spectrum of nutrition, sort of low calorie, but still okay.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't
Mm-hmm.
mean you don't do it. It just means you recognize, oh, I'm eating Pringles right now. I might be hungry later. Same thing. Oh, this is a pretty low nutrition snack, but later today, I'm going to balance it out with a 10-minute walk by myself.
Wow. I love that analogy. And I was just playing the guitar before we had this conversation, and that's one of the higher quality nutritional rests for me. It's there's a difference between that and listening to a podcast while I'm like doing chores around it. Like it's restful. That's restful in a way for me, but I love that way of thinking on like a continuum. Where do these different rest practices fall?
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear a bit about this. It's a day retreat that you've started for women. You meet at Chautauqua. It'd be one of my favorite places. One of my favorite places to hike when I lived in the area. Will you share a bit about uh, what what people do in that group? What the structure's like? How it supports people and more rest?
Yes, I chose Chautauqua to host the rest retreats because it is actually, if you look at the history of it, it is a place of gathering and leisure and natural pursuits, pursuits of learning, lifelong learning, and music. So that's
Wow.
kind of the history of how Chautauqua came to be. It was a movement towards those things for in the Victorian era. And so it really does, that location in Boulder really does symbolize, it kind of wraps up beautifully
Mm.
what I am hoping to impart to the participants of the rest retreat. And so in this really soothing environment, we use the power of group dynamic
Mm.
and shared experience, which if the women coming to this retreat in some way or another are struggling to, and I always, use this phrase, but put themselves first or add themselves to the list of who they're caring for. And so there's a real shared sense of understanding in that room when this group of women are sitting around together. And so the kind of, to your earlier question, the mechanism of change is do some of the psychoeducation like you and I have talked about today, the default mode network and what rest actually is and what it isn't, what it is. And then we do a lot of brainstorming for each person, like what is rest for you? Like you just mentioned, guitar is something that is kind of a higher nutrition, higher value rest. It's an activity, but one of the things you want to ask yourself when you're kind of evaluating and intentionally thinking about your days is, does this activity, is it calming and relaxing?
Mm.
So going on a hike with a friend is not necessarily calming and relaxing. It could be energizing. It could fill your bucket for, physical activity, and it could fill your bucket for social activity, and it could even fill your nature bucket. But it may not fill your rest and restoration bucket. So it's kind of an interesting way to think. So we have conversations like you and I are having now. I also have women we get into smaller breakout groups and we really take a hard look at what is preventing them from carving out time, sitting down, going to that yoga class, doing self-care practice of any sort. A lot of women come to the retreat and they really don't have a self-care practice to speak of. And so what are those blocks? And we do some kind of in-depth work around
Yeah.
what are the internal blocks on being able to self-prioritize.
Hmm. What are some of those common blocks?
Guilt and anxiety are the two top blocks. And you'll notice, Andrew, and you and I have talked about this before, those are not external blocks, and they're not blocks of not having enough time.
Mm.
And that's the first thing that people will say to you. Oh my gosh, self-care, who has time for that? And of course, you and I have just spent an hour talking about how the time already exists. It's how we allocate it, and it's how we develop a practice of using that time differently.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of become a dirty word in the rest retreat. When I
Uh-huh.
look at this group of women and I say, you know what? Time isn't the culprit here. There's
Mm.
something else. It's the guilt that we feel when we say, no, I can't, play a board game with you right now, 5-year-old kid in my life, or to our partner, no, I can't go on a hike with you today. I really think I need to go on that hike by myself. It's the guilt that comes up that prevents a lot of women from taking care of themselves. I think it prevents a lot of people in general. I think gender is not always as important in that picture. I think that for a lot of people in general, just guilt comes up about taking time for ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, and that relates to that caregiving part that a lot of people have, and people pleasing part. I know a lot of people have, including myself and in our society. And um, it's ironic that when we do take that time for ourselves to be there and nurture our own internal system, then we can show up in different ways and in more calm, loving ways to those around us. And that's such a good. And I have to say, Heather, it's just talking with you today that I notice a calmness, and I can tell that you're practicing what you preach. It's there's something really nice, even virtually, about interacting with someone who has that calm, uh, uh, calm state, and it's really really nice.
Right. Well, and I think what you're noticing is such an important component of this as one of the outcomes.
Mm,
Because
mm-hmm.
when we are burned out, and even if we're not fully burned out, Andrew, I think even if we're just not attending to ourselves enough, our empathy, our ability to sit with our own emotions is lower. So if our ability to sit with our own emotions is lower, then how in the world are we going to sit with those that we love and
Yeah,
their emotions?
yeah,
So, and our patience is lower. And so that is not a great ingredient for lower conflict relationships. The outcomes are really big and they have impact on our families and on our relationships. So what you're saying is so critical. When we take better care of ourselves, we probably feel a whole lot better, not only in our own bodies, but about how we're interacting with the people we most care about.
yeah, absolutely. And I do want to mention too, it's I know for me, there's moments where I'm really happy with how, much empathy I can show in relationship, or these values I have. And then with my family, friends, clients, and there's moments where some of my protective parts really start to run the show, and it's been helpful for me lately of that's okay. It's okay. Like those parts of me are in all of us, where it's like all a work in progress. And I think like these ideas of rest are so, and like these processes you're guiding people through both in your practice and in the group, it's just so helpful to catalyze that uh, being with those parts of us and having acceptance and love, and then showing that to others. Heather, I could talk to you for another hour, Heather. I love our conversations, and definitely want to have you back. But we're about the end of the hour here. before I ask you the last question, I generally ask guests, could you share a bit of your contact information if this is conversations resonating with people? How can they get in touch with you?
The best thing to do is probably go to my website, which is www.cornerhousetherapy.com. And I do have a retreat page there. The next retreat is scheduled for, we're going to do a winter retreat at Chautauqua, which I'm really
Oh,
excited about
wow.
because when you think of winter, it's such a natural time of
Yeah.
hibernation, reflection, and that's when the natural world takes its big rest, right? So I think that the winter Chautauqua retreat is going to be absolutely spectacular. So people can find more about the retreats there. And then, of course, just my practice in general and the work that I'm doing in my private practice is also there.
Perfect, and I'll link that in the show notes. The question I generally ask guests at the end is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with?
That's such a good question, Andrew. And so like you to ask this sort of positive and uplifting and connecting last question. I think with hope, I'm going to keep it tied to our conversation today. And that is that even for the most pressed among us, and I'm going to use the dirty word, the busiest among us, there probably are ways, little sips and little pockets, little 3-minute, 2-minute, 5-minute, 10-minute pockets, probably more than one in each of our days where we can tune in to ourselves. We can pause, we can breathe, we can come home to ourselves amidst the really busy nature of a lot of our lives. And that does give me hope. That means
Mm-hmm.
that this is attainable for almost every single one of us.
Yeah, wow, that's wonderful, and all the moments of connection, happiness, joy, but even being present for the hard experiences that we can make ourselves more available to when we do that. That's nice.
Mhm.
All right. Well, Heather,
Thank you for
thanks so much
having
for
me.
being on the podcast.
Yeah, it was absolutely delightful. And I'm like you, I could talk for a lot longer.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.